Under the pitch-black sky of Willow Creek, Tennessee, the headlights of James Jim Harper's old Ford sliced through the darkness on the red dirt road winding past the Cumberland forest. It was their 16th wedding anniversary, a night meant for celebration with Grace, the woman he loved more than life itself. Grace sat beside him, her deep blue dress hugging her graceful frame, her warm brown eyes sparkling as she shared a story about a struggling student at Willow Creek High she'd helped turn around. Jim smiled, his rugged, seal-trained hand gently squeezing hers, silently thanking her for the kindness that had pulled him from the shadows of his war-torn past. But that smile vanished when red and blue lights flared in the rearview mirror. "What's this about?" Grace whispered, a hint of worry in her voice. Jim slowed down, keeping his tone steady. "Probably just a routine stop. Don't worry." A patrol car pulled up behind them, and three figures emerged, their flashlights blinding as they swept across Jim's face. Sheriff Vernon Caldwell led the pack, his ruddy face framed by a hat, his sharp eyes glinting with a cold edge beneath a fake friendly veneer. "Step out, Harper," Vernon commanded, his voice low and authoritative. Jim frowned, a familiar tingle of danger from his military days prickling his spine. But he opened the door, hands visible. Grace followed, stepping out with the calm poise of a teacher used to handling tough kids. "We're just heading home from dinner," she said firmly. Vernon smirked, his gaze raking over her like she was a threat. "This ain't a friendly chat, Mrs. Harper," he replied, hand resting on his holstered pistol. The air grew thick with tension as Vernon's deputies fanned out, their boots crunching on gravel. Jim's instincts screamed ambush, but he kept his stance neutral, eyes locked on Vernon. "What's the problem, Sheriff?" he asked, voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. Vernon ignored him, nodding to his men. "Check the vehicle." Grace stepped forward, indignation flaring. "You've got no cause for this. We've done nothing wrong." Her words cut through the night, sharp and fearless, but Vernon's smirk widened into something menacing. "Cause? I'll find one," he sneered, then barked at Deputy Ethan Pratt, a jittery kid barely out of training. "Get her over here." Ethan hesitated, then grabbed Grace's arm. She yanked free, shouting, "Take your hands off me." The move was sudden, defiant, and it snapped something in Ethan. His hand jerked to his gun, panic flashing in his eyes. "Gun!" he yelled, a lie born of fear, and before Jim could react, a shot exploded. Grace's body jolted, a red stain blooming across her blue dress as she crumpled to the asphalt. "No!" Jim roared, lunging for her, catching her as she fell. Her eyes, wide with shock, met his, pleading, fading. "Jim!" she gasped, blood bubbling at her lips. Vernon cursed under his breath, stepping back as his men froze. Jim pressed his hands to her chest, desperate to stop the bleeding, but her warmth slipped away. "Stay with me, Grace," he begged, voice breaking. Then a taser's jolt hit him, and he collapsed beside her, the world fading to black as Vernon's shadow loomed overhead. James Jim Harper came to in a haze of pain, the cold bite of handcuffs digging into his wrists as the stale air of Willow Creek County Jail filled his lungs. The cell was a concrete box, dim, damp, and reeking of rust and despair. His head throbbed from the taser, but that was nothing compared to the ache in his chest, a hollow wound carved by Grace's last breath. Her face flashed in his mind, those warm brown eyes dimming, her blood soaking his hands. He clenched his fists, the metal cuffs clanking, as rage simmered beneath his grief. Sheriff Vernon Caldwell had orchestrated it all, a calculated execution masked as a traffic stop gone wrong. Jim knew the truth, but here, locked in this cage, it felt like a scream no one would hear. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and Vernon appeared outside the bars, his ruddy face smug under the flickering fluorescent light. "Rough night, Harper," he drawled, twirling a key card like a trophy. "Your wife's dead, and you're looking at assault and resisting arrest. Military vet gone rogue. Makes a hell of a story." Jim's gaze hardened, piercing through Vernon's bravado. "You murdered her," he said, voice low and lethal, each word a promise. Vernon chuckled, unfazed. "Prove it." "Oh, wait, you can't. Found a gun in your car, by the way. Funny how that happens." The lie was blatant. a setup Jim saw coming, but it fueled the fire inside him. As Vernon turned to leave, a guard slid an envelope through the bars. No stamp, no name. Jim's pulse quickened as he tore it open. Inside the envelope was a single slip of paper, typed in stark black ink. "The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Help is coming. Stay ready. Shadow." Jim's fingers tightened around the note, his mind racing. Shadow, whoever they were, knew he was here, knew what had happened. It was a lifeline, a whisper of hope in this hellhole, but also a mystery he couldn't unravel yet. He tore the paper into scraps, flushing them down the cell's rusted toilet, ensuring no trace remained. His SEAL training kicked in. Assess, adapt, survive. This wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about justice, about making Vernon and his cronies pay for Grace's blood. He swore it then, a silent oath carved into his soul. They'd regret the day they took her from him. The cell block door creaked open, and a new prisoner shuffled in. Ray Hound Dawson, a wiry man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a salt and pepper beard. He was dumped into the cell across from Jim's, his gaze locking onto Jim with a flicker of recognition. "Heard about you, Harper," Ray muttered once the guards were gone, voice barely above a whisper. "Community guy, ex-SEAL. Didn't peg you for a jailbird." Jim studied him, wary but curious. "Who are you?" he asked. Ray smirked faintly. "Ex-FBI. Pissed off the wrong people. Vernon's dirty, runs drugs, guns, cash through this town. Your wife got too close, didn't she?" The words hit like a punch, confirming Jim's suspicions. Ray leaned closer to the bars. "You're not alone in this fight, brother." The Willow Creek County Jail hummed with the dull rhythm of routine. Guards barking orders, keys jangling, the occasional groan of a rusted door. James Jim Harper sat on his bunk, eyes tracing the cracks in the concrete walls, every sense honed from years as a SEAL attuned to the patterns around him. 3 days had passed since Grace's murder. 3 days of Vernon's taunts and planted evidence tightening the noose around his neck. But today felt different. Ray Hound Dawson's words echoed in his mind. Vernon's empire was rotten, and Jim wasn't alone. The cryptic note from Shadow burned in his memory, a spark igniting his resolve. He needed out. Now. At 2 p.m., the guards marched him down the corridor for a psych evaluation, a sham to paint him as unhinged. His hands were cuffed, but his legs were free, a small oversight he'd exploit. As they passed the rec area, Ray was there, lounging with a group of inmates over a card game. Their eyes met briefly, a silent signal flashing between them. Then chaos erupted. Ray flipped the table with a roar. "You cheating bastard!" Cards scattered, fists flew, and the inmates piled into a brawl. The guard beside Jim hesitated, torn between his charge and the melee. "Stay here," he snapped, rushing to intervene. Jim's pulse surged. This was it. With a fluid motion, he looped his cuffed hands around the remaining guard's neck, a chokehold dropping him silently to the floor. The keys clinked as he snatched them from the guard's belt. Jim uncuffed himself, the metal clattering softly as he pocketed the keys in Vernon's key card, swiped from the guard's belt. The jail's alarms hadn't sounded yet. Ray's distraction was holding. He moved fast, sticking to the shadows of the corridor, his SEAL training guiding every step. The east exit loomed ahead, a steel door with a camera blind spot he'd clocked days ago. But as he rounded the final corner, Sheriff Vernon Caldwell stepped into view, a hulking silhouette against the dim light. "Going somewhere, Harper?" Vernon sneered, hand darting for his holster. Jim reacted faster, a brutal strike to Vernon's wrist sending the gun skittering across the floor. The sheriff lunged, meaty fists swinging, but Jim ducked, driving a knee into Vernon's gut. A final blow to the temple dropped him like a sack of bricks. Jim didn't pause to savor the moment. Sirens wailed as the jail woke to his escape. He swiped Vernon's badge, punched through the exit, and burst into the staff parking lot. A navy blue sedan sat unassuming among the patrol cars. Vernon's keys fit the ignition. Tires screeched as he peeled out, a bullet from a waking Vernon grazing his shoulder, hot blood trickling down his arm. The pain sharpened his focus. Freedom was his, but it came with a price. He needed allies, a plan, a place to hide. Travis Bear Malone's cabin in the Smoky Mountains flashed in his mind. The hunt was on, and Jim was no longer prey. The dirt road to Travis Bear Malone's cabin twisted through the Smoky Mountains, shrouded in mist as Jim Harper gunned the stolen sedan. Blood seeped from his grazed shoulder, a dull throb pulsing with every heartbeat, but he gritted his teeth and drove on. 50 miles from Willow Creek, this was his only shot at refuge. Travis, a fellow SEAL who'd saved Jim's life in Fallujah, had retreated to these woods after discharge, trading combat for solitude. The cabin came into view, rough-hewn logs, cameras disguised as birdhouses, blinking red in the dusk. Jim killed the engine 100 yards out, stepping into the chill air with hands raised, knowing Travis's paranoia didn't tolerate surprises. The cabin door creaked open, and Travis emerged, shotgun leveled, his tall frame leaner than Jim remembered, eyes hard as flint. "Heard about Grace on the scanner," Travis said, lowering the weapon as recognition softened his glare. "Been waiting for you." Jim nodded, exhaustion and grief crashing over him like a wave. Inside, the cabin was sparse, guns racked on one wall, monitors flickering with security feeds. "Vernon's framing me," Jim rasped, sinking into a chair. "Planted a gun, called it self-defense. They murdered her, Bear." Travis's jaw tightened. "Met Grace at your wedding. Good woman, better than us." He unlocked a cabinet, revealing an arsenal, pistols, knives, a laptop. "Take what you need. Vernon's tied to Roy Grayson, big money in Willow Creek. Drugs, weapons, cash. You're not just fighting a sheriff, Jim." Travis slid a burner phone across the table. "Police chatter's hot. They're calling you armed and dangerous, unstable vet on the loose. Vernon's got the town locked down." Jim's fingers curled around the phone, his mind already plotting. "I need evidence. Something to burn their empire down." Travis nodded, pulling up maps on the laptop. Warehouses, shell companies, properties tied to Roy Grayson's name. "This one," he tapped a spot near the Tennessee River. "High power usage, no legit business. Distribution hub." Before Jim could respond, the burner buzzed. An encrypted email from Shadow. He opened it, heart pounding. A video file loaded. Dash cam footage from Grace's murder. Vernon's voice barking orders. Ethan's panicked shot. Grace's scream cut short. Undeniable proof. "You've got a ghost on your side," Travis said, watching Jim's face harden as the clip ended. "Shadow's real." The door swung open, and a woman stepped in. Lena Carter, early 30s, sharp-eyed and wiry, a backpack slung over one shoulder. "You're a hard man to track, Harper," she said, voice cool. "I'm Shadow, ex-NSA, been watching Vernon's filth for years." She dropped a USB drive on the table. More where that came from. Financials, names, dates. Jim met her gaze, a flicker of hope piercing his rage. "Why me?" he asked. Lena's lips twitched. "Because you'll do what I can't. Bring it all down." The trio locked eyes, a silent pact forming. Vernon and Grayson wouldn't see them coming. The night hung heavy over the Tennessee River, the air thick with humidity as Jim Harper crouched in the shadows of a drainage ditch near Roy Grayson's secret warehouse. Floodlights buzzed overhead, casting stark beams across the gravel lot where armed guards patrolled in lazy loops. Inside that squat, steel-roofed building lay millions in drugs, Vernon and Grayson's lifeblood. Jim's shoulder ached from the bullet graze, but the pain sharpened his focus. Grace's face flashed before him, her last gasp, the blood on his hands, and his grip tightened on the silenced pistol Travis had given him. This wasn't just revenge, it was a message. Lena's intel had been precise. Patrol schedules, camera angles, weak points. She and Travis waited a mile out, ready with a drone to jam the warehouse's security if things went south. Jim slipped a small explosive from his pack, enough to cripple, not kill, planting it beneath a fuel tank near the south wall. His SEAL training guided every move, silent, swift, invisible. He was halfway to the North Service door when boots crunched nearby. Deputy Ethan Pratt, The kid who'd shot Grace stepped into view, flashlight sweeping the darkness. Jim froze, heart pounding, flattening himself against the wall. Ethan's beam passed inches from his boots, the deputy muttering nervously, "Damn shadows." Guilt clung to the kid's voice, a crack Jim could exploit later. For now he held his breath, waiting for Ethan to move on, the explosives timer ticking silently in the night. Ethan shuffled off, oblivious to the predator in his blind spot. Jim exhaled, slipping through the north door with a pick from Travis's kit. Inside, the warehouse reeked of chemicals, crates stacked high with plastic-wrapped bricks, Grayson's poison flooding Willow Creek. Jim rigged a second charge near the main storage, his hands steady despite the rage boiling inside. This wasn't about destruction alone, it was exposure. He snapped photos with a burner phone, evidence for Lena to blast online. As he finished, voices echoed, guards closing in. He melted into the shadows, exiting just as the first charge blew. A fireball lit the night, the fuel tank erupting in a deafening roar, drawing shouts and chaos from the guards. From a ridge half a mile away, Jim watched the warehouse burn, flames licking the sky as sirens wailed in the distance. He left his calling card, a single bullet and a scrawled note. "Everything you've built turns to ash." Travis's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Clean hit, brother?" "They're scrambling." Lena chimed in. "Uploading pics now. Vernon's gonna lose his mind." Jim's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. Back in Willow Creek, Sheriff Vernon Caldwell slammed his fist on his desk, news of the blaze crackling over the radio. "It's Harper," he snarled to Roy Grayson over the phone. "He's a dead man." Roy's voice was ice. "Find him, or we're both finished." The strike had landed. Vernon's empire was bleeding, and Jim was just getting started. The moon hung low over the outskirts of Willow Creek, casting a pale glow on Deputy Ethan Pratt's run-down bungalow. James Jim Harper watched from the tree line, his breath steady despite the storm of grief and fury churning inside. Ethan had pulled the trigger that killed Grace, and tonight, Jim would get answers. He'd tracked the kid's routine. Home late, drowning guilt in cheap whiskey. The warehouse hit had rattled Vernon's crew, and Ethan was the weakest link, a crack Jim could pry open. Clad in black, pistol holstered, he moved like a ghost across the yard, the lock on the back door yielding to his pick in seconds. Inside, the air stank of stale beer and regret. Ethan slumped in a recliner, bottle in hand, TV flickering with static. He didn't hear Jim until the barrel of a gun pressed against his temple. "Drop it," Jim growled, voice cold as steel. The bottle hit the floor with a thud, Ethan's bloodshot eyes widening in terror. "Harper, please, Jim cut him off, yanking him up and slamming him into a chair. Duct tape bound Ethan's wrists in a flash. The deputy's pleas muffled as Jim loomed over him. "You killed my wife," Jim said, each word a blade. He pulled a recorder from his pocket, red light blinking on. "Talk. Everything. Vernon, Grayson, the stop. Lie and you don't walk out of this room." Ethan's face crumpled, tears streaking down as the weight of that night broke him. Ethan's voice trembled as he spilled it all, the recorder catching every shaky word. "Vernon ordered the stop," he choked out. "Said Grace was digging too deep. Caught Jake Grayson selling pills at school, threatened to expose him. Roy wanted her scared off, not dead." Jim's jaw tightened. Grace, protecting her kids, had stumbled into their web. "It was supposed to be a warning," Ethan sobbed. "Plant some drugs, rough you up. But she fought back and I panicked. Vernon covered it, said it was self-defense." Jim leaned closer, eyes burning. "The gun in my car?" Ethan nodded, miserable. "Reed's idea. Vernon signed off." The confession was raw, unfiltered, proof of murder dressed up as law. Jim shut off the recorder, pocketing it as Ethan begged, "I'm sorry, Harper. I see her face every night. I didn't mean." Jim's hand shot out, gripping Ethan's throat, silencing him. "Sorry doesn't bring her back," he hissed, then released him, stepping back. "Call Reed. Tell him you saw me near here. Set a meet at the old quarry, then disappear. Bus station's 3 blocks away. Someone will find you in Portsmouth." Ethan nodded, dazed as Jim handed him a burner phone. Betray me, and I'll know. He vanished into the night, leaving Ethan shaking. The tape was gold, Vernon and Grayson's undoing, but Jim needed more. Ethan's fear would keep him running, and Reed's meat would be the next domino to fall. Grace's killers were unraveling, piece by piece. Dawn broke over Willow Creek with a vengeance, the quiet Tennessee town erupting as Ethan Pratt's confession blazed across the internet. Lena Carter, Shadow, had struck gold, pairing the deputy's tearful admission with the damning dash cam footage of Grace Harper's death. By mid-morning, Main Street was a battleground, protesters in blue ribbons, Grace's color, clashing with deputies, their shouts of "Justice for Grace" drowning out the hum of news helicopters overhead. James Jim Harper watched from a boarded-up gas station on the outskirts, his jaw tight as Travis handed him a burner phone. "It's hitting hard," Travis muttered. "They can't bury this." Jim nodded, the weight of Grace's loss now a weapon in his hands. Sheriff Vernon Caldwell's office was a war zone of its own. He stormed back and forth, sweat beading on his flushed face as reports flooded in. "Harper's turning my town against me," he bellowed at Deputy Reed, who shrank against the wall. "Ethan's tape. How'd it get out? Where's he at?" Reed stammered. "Gone, sir." Ran after Harper got to him. Vernon kicked a chair, splintering it. "One damn man." He snatched his phone, dialing Roy Grayson. "The kid's confessions everywhere. We're losing control. Feds are circling." Roy's voice cut through, icy and sharp. "End it, Vernon. Hire killers. Whatever it takes. Harper's head on a platter, or we're done." Vernon glared out the window at the growing crowd, his grip on Willow Creek slipping through his fingers. The unrest in Willow Creek swelled as dust settled, the protesters' chants echoing off the brick storefronts while police sirens wailed in futile counterpoint. Jim leaned against the gas station wall, replaying Ethan's confession in his mind. Grace's death tied to Jake Grayson's drug peddling at school, a thread she'd pulled too hard. Lena's voice crackled through the burner. "Social media's exploding. Half the state's watching. Vernon's panicking." Then came the bombshell. "Clara Monroe just went live," she added. "Says she saw Vernon on the phone ordering the hit before the stop." Jim's breath caught. Clara, Grace's nurse friend, had been a silent witness that night, her fear now shattered by courage. The tide wasn't just turning, it was a flood. Inside his office, Vernon's world unraveled faster. Clara's testimony hit the local news, her shaky voice detailing his call. "Make sure she backs off. Whatever it takes." Reed burst in, pale as death. "Sir, Clara's blown it wide open. The crowd's at the station doors. FBI's demanding files." Vernon's eyes bulged, veins pulsing. "That coward! Get me mercenaries, now! I want Harper dead before sunrise." He slammed the phone to Roy again. "Clara's flipped. We're exposed. Your brat's school stunt started this." Roy snapped back. "Handle it, or I'll bury you with him." Vernon grabbed his tactical vest, barking orders as Reed scrambled. Outside, the mob surged, a reckoning Vernon couldn't outrun. Jim's war had gone public, and the storm was breaking wide open. The Grayson estate loomed on the outskirts of Willow Creek, a gaudy fortress of wealth carved from Tennessee limestone, its manicured lawns now shadowed by chaos spilling from the town. James Jim Harper slipped through the night, a phantom in black, the uproar of Clara's testimony and the warehouse blaze still ringing in his ears. Roy Grayson's panic room was his target. Lena's intel pinpointed it beneath the mansion, a steel vault where the kingpin hid with his son Jake. Jim's silenced pistol hung heavy at his side, but the recorder in his pocket was his real weapon tonight. He needed Roy's confession, the final nail in their coffin. Security was lax, guards distracted by the protests rocking downtown. Jim scaled a rear wall, cutting through a power line to kill the exterior lights. The mansion plunged into darkness, emergency generators humming faintly as he pried open a basement window. Inside, the air was thick with opulence, marble floors, gilt frames. But Jim moved with purpose, descending a service stairwell toward the panic room. Travis's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Vernon's mercenaries are inbound. 10 minutes out. Move fast." Jim nodded to himself, planting a small charge on the panic room's reinforced door. He tapped the detonator, the blast a muted thud that buckled the steel. The door groaned open, revealing Roy Grayson, pale and sweating, and Jake, wide-eyed beside him. "Harper!" Roy spat, reaching for a desk drawer. Jim leveled his gun. "Don't. We're talking." Roy froze, hand hovering over the drawer as Jim stepped into the panic room, the recorder's red light blinking on. "Everything. Your operation. Grace's murder." "Now," Jim ordered, voice like ice. Roy's defiance crumbled under that stare. "Vernon runs the streets. I fund it. Drugs, guns, cash through my properties," he rasped, glancing at Jake, who shrank back. "Grace caught Jake dealing at school. Threatened to report it. Vernon said she'd ruin us. It was just a scare job." Jim's grip tightened. "She's dead because of you," Roy stammered. "There's bigger players. State level. I'm just a cog." The confession poured out, raw and damning, every word captured. A sudden crash upstairs jolted them. Vernon's mercenaries had arrived, boots pounding through the mansion. "Time's up," Travis barked through the earpiece. "Get out!" Jim zip-tied Roy to a chair, snatching Jake as leverage. "You're coming with me." The kid yelped, but Jim dragged him toward the stairwell as gunfire erupted above. Travis burst through a side door, blood trickling from a grazed arm, laying cover fire with a rifle. "Go!" he shouted, pinning down two mercenaries. Jim hauled Jake through the chaos, bullets chewing the walls as they hit the lawn. A stolen SUV roared up, Lena at the wheel. "Inside!" she yelled. Jim shoved Jake in, diving after as tires screeched. The mansion shrank in the rear view, Roy's confession secure. But Vernon's wrath was closing in. The war was far from over. The old police training facility squatted on the edge of Willow Creek, a crumbling relic of rusted beams and overgrown weeds, abandoned since budget cuts gutted the department years ago. James Jim Harper stood in its shadow, the night air cool against his skin as he checked the traps he'd set, tripwires and flash charges rigged from the facility's old gear. Roy Grayson's confession burned a hole in his pocket, but Sheriff Vernon Caldwell remained the head of the snake. Jim had texted him from a burner. "Just you and me. Finish it." Vernon would come. Pride and desperation wouldn't let him refuse. Grace's face fueled Jim's resolve. This ended tonight. Headlights pierced the darkness as Vernon's convoy rolled in, mercenaries fanning out with tactical precision. Jim slipped on thermal goggles, watching them breach the perimeter through Lena's drone feed in his earpiece. "They're splitting up. Vernon's central," she whispered. Jim triggered the first charge. A blinding flash and a boom that sent the hired guns reeling, smoke choking the air. Shouts of confusion erupted as they stumbled into crossfire zones Jim had mapped out. He melted into the facility's heart, a cavernous training room lit by a single bulb swaying overhead. Vernon burst in, shotgun raised, 4 mercenaries at his heels. "Harper!" he bellowed, voice thick with fury. "Show yourself!" Jim stepped halfway into the light, hands empty but stance lethal. "Send them away, Sheriff. This is ours." Vernon's eyes narrowed, weighing the bait. Vernon smirked, a predator's grin, and waved his men off. "Wait outside, he's mine." The mercenaries hesitated, then backed out, leaving the 2 men alone in the flickering light. "You think you've won?" Vernon spat, pumping his shotgun. "Grace was collateral. Your war's torn my town apart." Jim's voice was steel. "Your town? You poisoned it. Drugs, corruption, her blood on your hands." He tossed Roy's confession tape forward. It skidded to Vernon's feet. "That's with the feds now. You're done." Vernon's face twisted and he fired, the blast shattering the silence. Jim dove, rolling as buckshot shredded the wall behind him. In a blur, Jim closed the gap, wrenching the shotgun free with a savage twist. Vernon swung a fist, catching Jim's jaw, but Jim countered, slamming him into a pillar. They grappled, raw and brutal, until Jim pinned him, knee on Vernon's chest. "Bigger players, huh?" Jim snarled, echoing Roy's words. Vernon gasped, defiant. "State level. Senators, cops. You'll never touch them." Jim yanked a camera from his pack, switching it on. "Talk, or I show you what SEALs do to cowards." Vernon's bravado cracked. He rasped out names, dates, The whole rotten network, caught on tape. Sirens wailed outside, FBI closing in. Jim stood, leaving Vernon sprawled, defeated. "For Grace," he whispered, stepping into the night as agents stormed the building. The fight wasn't over, but Vernon's reign was. The Willow Creek County Courthouse buzzed with tension, its oak-paneled walls packed with townsfolk as the trial of Sheriff Vernon Caldwell and Roy Grayson entered its final days. James Jim Harper sat at the defense table, his suit loose from weeks of strain, but his posture rigid, a SEAL's discipline unbowed. The gallery wore blue ribbons, Grace's color, a quiet tribute to the woman whose death had sparked this reckoning. Vernon's confession tape, Roy's panicked admissions, and the dash cam footage had gutted their defense. Today, justice would be weighed, and Jim's fate hung in the balance. Hero or vigilante, the jury would decide. District Attorney Paul Hensley called Vernon to the stand, the ex-sheriff a hollow shell in orange, his swagger gone. "You've pleaded guilty to corruption, trafficking, and conspiracy in Grace Harper's murder," Hensley began, voice sharp. "Correct?" Vernon nodded, eyes down. "Yes. And Mr. Harper's actions, did they threaten public safety?" Vernon's jaw tightened. "He hit my operations, warehouses, men, used explosives, chaos." Hensley pressed. "A vigilante?" "Damn right," Vernon snapped. Jim's attorney, Carla Evans, a tenacious public defender, rose for cross. "Sheriff, did you order Grace Harper's death?" Vernon's silence was damning. "Yes," he muttered finally. "Was there cause for that stop?" "No." "Was she armed?" "No." Carla's voice cut deeper. "Did your corruption block every legal path for justice?" Vernon slumped. "Yeah." The room hushed, the weight of his words sinking in. Jim's fight had been lawless, but it had cracked open a festering wound. FBI agent Helen Ortiz took the stand next, her crisp blazer a stark contrast to Vernon's defeat. "I investigated Willow Creek's corruption after Mr. Harper's evidence surfaced," she testified, voice steady. "Without his actions, Vernon's network, statewide ties included, would have stayed buried." Hensley frowned. "But he broke laws." "Yes," Helen admitted. "Yet he surrendered peacefully, handed us everything." Carla seized the opening. "Could justice have prevailed without him?" Helen paused. "Number. The system here was rotten, files lost, witnesses silenced." The jury shifted, faces softening. Jim's gaze stayed fixed, Grace's memory steadying him. Judge Amos Reed delivered the verdict late that afternoon. "On assault and property destruction, guilty," he intoned, "but on vigilantism causing harm, not guilty. Necessity applies." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 3 years probation, served at Willow Creek Community Center. Relief washed over Jim. Not freedom, but purpose. Outside, he faced Grace's grave, dusk painting the sky gold. "It's done," he whispered, laying a white rose on the stone. "Vernon got 30 years, Roy 25. They're finished." Tears fell as he traced her name, etched with "beloved wife, teacher, light." Clara approached, eyes red. "She'd be proud, Jim." He nodded, the weight lifting slightly. Later at the safe house, Lena handed him a file. State-level corruption, bigger fish. "Helen's digging," she said. "You in?" Jim hesitated, Grace's fight echoing in him. This wasn't the end. Justice demanded more, and he'd carry her torch forward. The Willow Creek Community Center hummed with life, kids laughing in self-defense classes, adults bent over books in literacy sessions, a legacy Grace Harper had built, now thriving under James Jim Harper's quiet watch. 6 weeks after the trial, the town was healing. New police leadership, Roy Grayson's assets seized, Vernon's cronies turning on each other. Jim stood in the gym, hands in pockets, watching Jake Grayson, of all people, coach a group of teens. The kid had begged to help, guilt driving him to atone. Jim had agreed, seeing Grace's belief in second chances reflected in the boy's shaky resolve. It wasn't forgiveness, just purpose. Lena Carter slipped in, her presence sharp as ever. "Got something," she said, handing him a dossier. bank records, coded emails, surveillance shots. Vernon wasn't lying. State-level players, a senator named Charles Dutton among them. Drugs, trafficking, all tied to what we broke here. Jim flipped through, jaw tightening. Grace's death was a symptom of something vast, festering beyond Willow Creek. Helen Ortiz is building a case, Lena added, but she's hitting walls, political pressure, needs us. Jim's gaze drifted to a photo on the wall, him and Grace, smiling at a center fundraiser. No more violence, he said firmly. We do this right. Legal, clean. Lena nodded. Truth as a weapon, Grace's way. The idea settled in him, a path forward, but doubt gnawed. Could he balance this fight with the peace he'd promised her memory? Jim retreated to the house he'd shared with Grace, a place he'd avoided for months after her death. Now he sat on their bed, opening a wooden box of keepsakes, photos, her notes, a letter from years back when he'd struggled post-seal. The fight for justice never ends, she'd written, but love's our strength. Heal, don't harm. Her words hit like a lifeline, easing the tension in his chest. He'd avenged her with blood and fire, but this was her real legacy. Carla Evans knocked softly, stepping in with a mug of coffee. You're brooding, she teased, then sobered. The center's saving lives, Jim. That's enough, but it doesn't have to be all. She was right. The next morning, Jim met Lena at a diner outside town, the dossier between them. I'm in, he said. We build a coalition. FBI we trust. Journalists. Victims. No shadows this time. Full light. Lena grinned faintly. Dutton's dirty as sin. We've got a shot. Jim glanced out at the dawn breaking over the hills, Grace's voice in his mind. Heal. Don't harm. He'd honor her by dismantling the rot, not with fists, but with truth. Back at the center, he found Jake waiting. Clara's taking over tomorrow. I'm ready to help however you need, the kid said, earnest. Jim nodded, a plan forming. The bigger war loomed, and Willow Creek's rebirth would be his anchor as he stepped into it. Twilight draped Willow Creek in amber as Jim Harper stood on the community center steps, the town's heartbeat pulsing around him. Kids sparring in the gym, families rebuilding what corruption had torn apart. Months had passed since Vernon's fall, and Jim's coalition with Lena Carter and FBI agent Helen Ortiz had grown, a web of truth stretching beyond Tennessee. Tonight it would end. Lena had unearthed a recording from Vernon's safe, Senator Charles Dutton's voice, crisp and commanding, orchestrating the state's criminal underbelly. Air it live, Jim had told Helen. And now news crews swarmed Nashville, 60 miles away, where Dutton faced a press conference, oblivious to the trap. Jim watched the feed on a laptop inside, Helen's team poised at the Capitol. Dutton strutted out, all polished charm, denying ties to Willow Creek's scandal. Then the audio hit, his orders to Vernon echoing through speakers, undeniable. The crowd gasped, cameras flashed as FBI agents surged forward, cuffing him mid-sentence. You're finished, Helen's voice cut through the chaos, a promise fulfilled. Jim's chest tightened, not with triumph, but relief. Grace's killers were down, their puppet master too. Back at the center, Clara Monroe approached, eyes bright. It's over, Jim. You did it. He shook his head. We did. She did. He handed her the center's keys. Keep it going. I've got one last stop. The war was won, but peace beckoned at Grace's grave, a final reckoning with the past. The cemetery lay quiet under a star-strewn sky, Grace Harper's headstone glowing faintly in the dusk. Teacher, wife, light endures. Jim knelt, placing her letter beside a white rose, its ink faded, but her words alive. Heal, don't harm. We got him, Grace, he murmured, voice breaking. Dutton's in cuffs. Your fight reached further than you knew. Tears fell, not from rage, but a softening ache. Footsteps crunched behind him. Jake Grayson, hesitant, holding a folded paper. The kids made this, he said, offering a card signed with messages of thanks. For her, for you. Jim took it, stunned. The boy who'd sparked this nightmare now stood redeemed, a bridge Grace would have built. Jim rose, clapping Jake's shoulder. Stay here, make it right. Jake nodded, a vow in his eyes. As he walked away, Jim turned back to Grace's grave, the weight of years lifting. He'd torn down an empire with fire, then rebuilt with light, her light. The center thrived, Willow Creek breathed free, and justice rang beyond its borders. Lena's voice crackled through a burner. Helen says Dutton's singing. More heads'll roll. You're done? Jim smiled faintly. Yeah, I'm home. He stepped into the fading glow, Grace's letter in hand, her love his compass. The fight was over, not with a bang, but a quiet promise kept. Healing had won, and in that victory, Jim found peace at last, her legacy etched in every step forward.